So combating modern slavery is one of the biggest challenges for the global community. And combating modern slavery is really important because it's one of the most horrific of crimes that involves serious human rights abuses, and it has long-term impacts for survivors. But combating modern slavery is also important because we all use goods and services tainted by modern slavery every day. And this helps feed the demand for modern slavery and means that modern slavery can thrive in global supply chains. So today there's an estimated 40 million people who are victims of modern slavery around the world. And here in Australia, we know that as the Australian government, there's up to 1,900 people in situations of modern slavery at any one time. And this means that we all have a really important role to play because modern slavery does happen right here, right now, both in global supply chains, but also here in Australia.
Modern slavery is one of those issues that people tend to think happens everywhere else and overseas and is not relevant to our own life here in Australia. We know that there's documented cases of modern slavery in Australia. Some of the risk areas in Australia have been in agriculture, in the cleaning sector, in security, domestic work, and a number of other areas. And we know that modern slavery, it tends to be a concept where we think about people who are owned by someone else, but very much it's a system of control and coercion. And modern slavery, it's important to remember that it exists on a continuum. So from a sort of decent workplace to a workplace which has encompassed modern slavery, there's a lot of risk factors in between, a lot of bad work practices. But modern slavery, a way to think about it is to think about control and exploitation and an element of coercion where a worker loses the ability to make independent decisions about their life and about their work life with it.
Absolutely, modern slavery exists in Australia. There's about 40 million slaves across the world, and they predict that there's maybe about 15,000 in Australia. So it's a real issue here. Predominantly, we're seeing a lot of slavery incidents in horticulture supply chains. We have seen, and this is evidenced through the news recently, that we've seen a lot of slaves forced into sex trafficking events as well. So in Australia, it's really pertinent for businesses to understand what those modern slavery risks are and to ensure that they're responding to those in a manner that also deals with any consequences that those victims of slavery might be feeling.
There are estimated to be 46 million people enslaved worldwide, with 62% in the Asia-Pacific region, including in Australia and New Zealand. Clearly, modern slavery, which encompasses forced labour, debt bondage, human trafficking and child labour, is not something we can accept in global society now. Australia's modern slavery reporting requirement aims to increase transparency on business operations and supply chains. Accountants are often involved in organisations' procurement and finance functions, and so are well placed to help identify the risks of modern slavery.
So it's really important that businesses that respond to modern slavery involve all areas of the business, and it's not just an issue that should be the domain of legal practitioners or of sustainability teams. And modern slavery is actually a risk to the long-term financial viability and sustainability of businesses, and that makes it an issue that accountants should consider and engage with as well. And as accountants, there's maybe 3 practical ways that you can support businesses who are starting to work through identifying and addressing their modern slavery risks. The first is that as the accountant, you can help businesses to understand which parts of their operations and their structure might be covered by modern slavery reporting laws like the Australian Modern Slavery Act. Second is that as accountants and the gatekeepers and the guardians of financial information for a business, you're in a really great position to help businesses understand how modern slavery risks, if not addressed, can pose financial risks to the business. And thirdly, accountants can also play a really important role in helping identify risk areas in the business's operations and supply chains and helping to audit and assess the extent of those risks.
So accountants are an industry that are built on the sort of backbone of assurance and certification. And what this new modern slavery law requires in Australia is for companies to report. And someone like an industry like the accountants are going to be involved in assurance around that. So they're going to be looking at what were the steps that were taken to produce the report? What is the sort of due diligence that was required to be conducted? So accountants are basically there to hopefully help professionalise the system, provide advice, provide assurance, and by asking a lot of deep questions that are not just compliance focused, but are substantively looking at how we address this issue.
Accountants are really part of the engine room for business. So they're there to really help work with CFOs and other parts of the business to set the financial strategy for a business. And therefore they can be really pertinent in terms of influencing what that strategy looks like, what the financial forecasting should look like, considering what provisions, if any, need to be made for any potential action that might happen, so litigation or shareholder resolutions, or actually the need to remediate victims. So they're really important in understanding what that broader context is and then applying that in a financial sense to the business.
So it's really important that businesses that are just starting out in assessing and addressing their modern slavery risks understand the business case for compliance. Combating modern slavery as a business is the right thing to do, but it's also something that makes good business sense. So businesses that take action against modern slavery can improve the integrity and the quality of their supply chains. They can increase their access to business opportunities. They can improve their relationships with customers and their workforce. And they can also increase their access to investment opportunities and improve customer satisfaction. And conversely, businesses that choose not to take action put themselves at risk of reputational and sometimes legal damage. And it also will limit their ability to do business in the global marketplace, where customers and business partners are increasingly asking, what are you doing about modern slavery risks that might be present here in your supply chain?
So one of the first things businesses have to do is to understand their own operations and supply chain, and to understand where risks might be, modern slavery might be in that. And so your first thing you have to do is start asking questions about our own operations, but also about what our supply chains looked. You have to develop a relationship with your suppliers. So it's not a sort of a gotcha compliance framework. It's understanding and deepening that relationship. But the first thing really you've got to do is start to ask questions about how your business operates and where it is operating, where it's sourcing goods from, where you're providing advice to, where you're providing loans to. And then as you go along and develop that understanding of mapping your operations and supply chains, you start to prioritise those risks. So you have to figure out, how do we assess risks? How do we prioritise it? Who do we need to talk to understand this? How do we skill up? Who do we need to collaborate with? And so it's that sort of asking questions, looking deeply at our operations, and figuring out where the expertise is where your business starts first.
I think it's very easy when you've got a legislative act that has a reporting requirement to just think about things in terms of how should we respond to the reporting requirement. It's really important to go beyond that. It's important to look at modern slavery in terms of your broader human rights risks, and to use the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as the guidelines for that. So really think about this in terms of what else can you do beyond just fulfilling your own compliance requirements for the Act. What can you do to put in place effective mechanisms to allow potential victims or victims of modern slavery to air their grievances? And how can you work with the communities here, but also your worker communities in your overseas supply chain to reduce those risks of modern slavery?
Don't view this as a compliance exercise. We see a lot of businesses looking at it as just a sort of tick box approach to produce a modern slavery statement, whereas really the aim of the legislation is to use reporting as a mechanism to change behaviour within business and actually help those businesses shine a light on their reporting and supply chains, and actually eradicate modern slavery within those. So it's really a proactive approach, and it's a behaviour and process change that's needed, not just a report.